They thought she was just another drifter, skinny, worn boots, and a battered hat pulled low. They didn't know she could draw faster than the desert wind. By the time the sun set, those men would learn. The West keeps its own justice. The sun rose hot and sharp over the high desert, its first light spilling across miles of sagebrush and red earth. Heat shimmered even in the morning cool, bending the distant buttes into wavering mirages. Somewhere out there, a hawk's shadow crossed the sand like a warning, though no one was left to hear it except the men who'd broken loose from their chains. The prison wagon had rolled through the night, iron wheels crunching over rock and dust, its passengers silent and shackled until the moment came. It started with a single shout, a flash of steel, and the crack of a guard's skull against the wagon boards. Horses screamed, the driver tumbled, and before the sun was an hour old, 6 men were free, men with nothing left but hate in their eyes and rifles in their hands. They took what they wanted from the dead, left the bodies for the buzzards, and scattered into the wide-open emptiness like wolves scenting blood. By the time the smoke from the burning wagon drifted into the next settlement, the town's few early risers were already whispering. On the wooden porch of the general store, a grizzled rancher spat into the dust. "Headed south," he muttered, "and no law this side of the river." His companion only grunted, glancing toward the horizon as if expecting trouble to walk right down the main street. The sheriff's office door swung on its hinges, the man inside already strapping on his gun belt and swearing under his breath. There were too many miles between here and the nearest posse, and too few men to hold the line. Far beyond their worried eyes, a lone rider moved through the open country, her silhouette blurred in the heat. Clara Dane sat easy in the saddle of a chestnut mare, the reins loose in her hand. She wasn't in a hurry, nor was she lost. Her kind never was. Dust clung to the hem of her duster, her hat shadowing a face that gave nothing away. She looked like the sort who kept to herself, the sort no one remembered once she'd passed by. The trail ahead was empty save for the bleached bones of some long-dead steer and the dry whisper of wind in the grass. Clara's eyes moved over everything, the horizon, the sky, the soft scuff of her horse's hooves. Her right hand rested light against her thigh, fingers never far from the worn grip of the Colt hidden under her coat. It was an old habit, born of years when the wrong moment's hesitation could mean the end. In town, folks knew little of her. She'd worked a branding line 2 weeks back, quiet and efficient, her voice rarely rising above a low drawl. Before that, she'd fixed fences for a widow out by Willow Creek, then disappeared without a word. Some said she was a ranch hand's widow herself, drifting from job to job. Others thought she was just another lonely soul chasing wages in a country that ate people alive. No one asked where she came from. No one guessed at what she could do. The sheriff, leaning in the doorway of his office, squinted after her when she passed through last week. "That one's a ghost," he told his deputy. "Here and gone before you know it." He never saw the way her eyes cut to every shadow, or how her posture tightened when men laughed too loud behind her. He didn't notice the saddlebag with the weight in it, or the faint glint of steel hidden under oilcloth. Out in the wilds, the escaped prisoners moved like a sandstorm, fast, unpredictable, and leaving ruin behind them. The leader, Jeb Crowley, was the kind of man who'd slit a throat for the shine on a coin. His men were no better, desperate, mean, their hunger for survival sharpened into cruelty. Somewhere in that stretch of wilderness, the dust from their boots rose and drifted with the wind, merging with the land's natural haze, until only a trained eye could tell it was trouble coming. Clara reined in atop a low ridge, scanning the southern flats. Far out, almost lost in the shimmer, she saw a faint smudge in the air. It was too wide for cattle, too steady for a storm. Her mouth tightened, but she didn't turn back. Instead, she leaned forward, speaking low to the mare, and started down toward the canyon road. The hours stretched thin under the sun. Her canteen sloshed softly at her hip, and the mare's breath came in slow, steady huffs. Once, she paused to water the horse at a shallow stream, her reflection rippling in the current. She knelt to splash her face, but her eyes kept lifting to the ridgelines, watching for shapes that didn't belong. Miles behind her, in a nameless ravine, Jeb Crowley kicked at the dirt, studying the tracks left by a single horse. "A woman," he said, voice low and sharp. "Headed our way." One of his men chuckled, a coarse sound that earned him a flat stare from Jeb. "Don't underestimate what you don't know." The leader growled. Still, the hunger in their eyes said they'd already decided she'd be easy pickings. By late afternoon, the air hung heavy with the smell of sun-baked earth and distant mesquite smoke. Clara's mare lifted her head, ears twitching toward some sound too faint for the human ear. Clara listened too, her stillness as complete as the rocks around her. Then she eased back into the saddle and kept riding, each step measured. Behind her, the dust cloud grew, twisting and curling like a storm front. The land between them was empty, but emptiness meant little out here. Outlaws could cover ground fast when they had the will, and men with nothing to lose had more will than most. In the town she'd left behind, the sheriff was pacing. A young boy, barefoot, dust on his cheeks, had come in gasping about a burned wagon, dead men, and killers heading south. The sheriff cursed and looked to the map pinned to his wall. The road south ran through Dead Man's Canyon, and anyone caught in there with those men would be lucky to come out breathing. But Clara wasn't thinking about luck. She was thinking about the canyon's narrow walls, about the way sound carried there, about how a single rider could disappear into its shadows until the time came to strike. The mare's ears flicked again, and this time Clara smiled faintly, a small, private thing that never reached her eyes. The horizon ahead glowed gold in the dying sun, but the one behind her darkened with gathering dust. Somewhere between those two skies, the paths of a lone rider and 6 desperate men were drawing closer with each heartbeat. The air felt charged, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, and Clara Dane, who to all the world looked like nothing more than a tired drifter, kept her pace steady, riding straight toward the storm. Jeb Crowley rode at the head of the pack, his lean frame silhouetted against the pale blaze of the afternoon sky. The man had the wiry strength of a starving wolf, all tendon and sinew, and his eyes, cold, pale, gunmetal gray, never softened. He rode like someone who owned the ground beneath his horse, and every mile of air above it. When Jeb gave an order, men didn't question it. His first order after breaking free had been simple: no witnesses. They found the homestead just before sundown, a squat, weathered cabin with a smokehouse out back, and a few heads of cattle grazing near the fence. The family had been at their evening meal when the outlaws came. Doors kicked in. Shouts. The children didn't even have time to cry before the first shots rang out. By the time the sun dipped low, the cabin was burning. Cattle lay sprawled with their bellies torn open, and Jeb was rifling through a cedar chest for anything worth carrying. Smoke curled into the darkening sky, a black flag announcing what had been done here. From the edge of the field, a single pair of eyes watched. A boy, no older than 10, pressed himself into the shadows of the hayloft, holding his breath while splinters dug into his skin. He listened to boots crunch over straw, to the creak of leather, to the hiss of fire chewing through dry timber. Only when the hoofbeats faded did he crawl out, soot on his face and fear burning in his chest. By dawn, the gang had moved on, and so had the boy, stumbling barefoot down a cattle trail that cut through the hills. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. Clara spotted him near midday, a thin figure limping along the trail with dust caked to his legs. She pulled up her mare, studying him from under the brim of her hat. The boy stopped, staring back, not sure whether to run or stand still. His lips were cracked, his voice raw when he finally spoke. "They're coming," he rasped. "6 of 'em. Killed my pa, burned the house." He swallowed, his eyes darting over her shoulder as if the devils themselves might be right behind her, heading for the pass. Clara's gaze drifted toward the southern horizon. The canyon pass lay that way, narrow, shadowed, and treacherous. Perfect ground for an ambush. She could turn south, skirt the rim, and avoid the trouble altogether. Her jaw tightened as if she were weighing it, but her eyes didn't change. "Go north," she told him. "Find the town. Tell the sheriff." She dug in her saddlebag and tossed him a strip of jerky and her spare canteen. The boy clutched them, nodding, though his gaze lingered on her as she nudged the mare forward. By the time she was 100 yards away, He was running in the opposite direction, her silhouette shrinking against the land. Clara never looked back. The day bled into evening, the desert sky painted in violent shades of orange and violet. Clara stopped in the lee of a boulder where the wind was calmer, unsaddled the mare, and let her drink from a leather pail. The animal lowered its head, ears flicking while Clara moved with quiet efficiency, brushing down the coat, checking the hooves, running a hand along the cinched strap. When she bent to adjust the saddlebag, the flap fell open just enough for the last light to catch on polished metal. A revolver rested there, unlike any carried by common hands, its barrel short for speed, the walnut grip smoothed by years of use. Faded etching ran along the steel, and at the base of the grip, carved deep, were the initials CD. She closed the flap and cinched it tight, her expression still unreadable. Far to the west, the Outlaws reached a flyspeck of a town, a scattering of buildings around a watering trough. They rode straight to the saloon, dust rising off their boots as they pushed through the doors. Conversation died quick. The barkeep poured whiskey without being asked. Jeb leaned on the counter, letting the drink burn down his throat before he spoke. "Any riders come through?" His voice was quiet, but it carried. A drunk at the far end of the bar lifted his head, squinting through the haze. "Saw one," he slurred. "Woman. Hat pulled low. Heading south." He chuckled. "Didn't look like much. Guess she don't know what's waiting down that way." The corner of Jeb's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, more the shadow of something sharper. He set down his glass and pushed away from the bar. "She will," he said. Outside, his men mounted up, the sound of horses snorting and shifting breaking the stillness. Jeb swung into his saddle, eyes narrowing toward the fading light. Somewhere out there, the dust from her mare's hooves was settling into the same earth his would soon tear through. Night crept over the land in slow layers, the stars sliding into place above. The wind carried with it the faint scent of burned wood from the homestead miles behind, a reminder of what trailed in Jeb Crowley's wake. Somewhere ahead, the canyon waited, its dark corridors carved by time and the restless breath of the desert. And riding toward it, with the steadiness of someone who had already decided her course, was Clara Dane, alone, silent, and heading straight into the path of 6 men who thought they knew what kind of fight she had in her. The sun had barely crested the far ridge when Clara rode into Dead Man's Canyon, its sheer red walls rising like the gates of some ancient fortress. The light was pale and gold, touching the cliff faces so they burned with a muted fire. Her mare's hooves struck against loose stone, each step echoing in the narrow pass. A chill still lingered in the air, clinging to the shaded rock, but above, vultures wheeled in lazy, silent arcs, the shadows gliding over her path like omens. She kept her gaze forward, her body loose in the saddle, but every nerve was awake, attuned to the canyon's breathing. Somewhere behind her, not far enough for comfort, men were moving, men with eyes full of hunger and hands quick to draw iron. She didn't have to see them to know they were there. The canyon funneled sound strangely, sending faint scuffs and murmurs in all directions. Still, she could feel the pattern of their hunt. They were spreading wide, like a net tightening. She reached a trickle of water spilling from a crack in the rock and slid down from the saddle. The mare lowered her head, drinking slow and deep. Clara let her eyes travel across the cliffs, noting the crumbling ledges, the pockets of shadow where a man might wait. A loose pebble clattered somewhere behind and above, quick and sharp like the snap of a twig. Her hand drifted near the butt of her revolver, but she didn't turn. Instead, she crouched, running her fingers through the stream, letting the cold bite her skin until the moment passed. Her mind wandered, unbidden, to another canyon far from here, years ago, when the air was heavy with gunpowder and cannon smoke. She had worn Union blue then, her hair tucked under a battered hat, her eyes bright with the confidence of youth. The memory unfolded quick and vivid, her standing before a line of officers, a battered Spencer rifle in her hands. She had fired at a distant target across a dry riverbed, the crack of the shot echoing back like applause, the officers' nods betraying surprise that a girl could hit that far, that fast. She had never forgotten the way the rifle bucked, or how the men tried to mask their respect beneath casual smirks. The sound of her mare's steady drinking pulled her back. She stood, brushing dust from her knees, and glanced at the trail behind her. She knew exactly what she would leave them, prints deep enough to follow, broken twigs marking her passage, the occasional scuff on rock. Let them believe she was unaware, desperate even. She mounted again, the leather creaking softly, and urged the mare onward, deeper into the canyon's throat. The day stretched, shadows creeping down the cliffs. Heat shimmered off the stone, baking the air until each breath felt dry and thin. Somewhere to her right, far off, a voice called low, a signal. Another answered from the left. They thought they were closing the trap. She almost smiled. By dusk she reached a small clearing where the cliffs opened just enough to let in a sliver of sky. A few scrub trees leaned against the rock, their branches twisted and black from lightning strikes years before. She dismounted, moving slow, deliberate, letting her steps drag, so they'd know she was here. The fire she built was small but visible, a flicker of orange against the darkening walls. She cooked nothing, ate nothing, only sat with her back to the stone, eyes on the narrow pass she had just come through. The mare stood tethered nearby, her ears flicking at every distant sound. The canyon fell quiet in that way it sometimes did. No wind, no bird, only the faint hiss of cooling stone. That was when she heard it. A single step on loose grit, then another. Her eyes shifted without moving her head, catching a darker shadow among the others. The figure came slow, careful, one hand at his side. The sound came next, a soft, mechanical click, almost polite in its intent. A hammer drawn back. She didn't rise, didn't speak. Somewhere in the dark above, there was a whisper of movement, the faint scrape of metal against leather. The man froze mid-step, eyes flicking upward. The shot was so clean it was almost gentle. No roar, no chaos. Just the brief crack of a rifle echoing through stone. The man collapsing before his gun left its holster. His body slumped sideways, dust rising around him, and the canyon swallowed the sound as if nothing had happened. Clara didn't move for a long moment. Her eyes stayed on the pass, waiting for the others. When nothing came, she leaned forward, adding another stick to the fire, the sparks curling upward into the deepening night. The cliffs above glowed faintly under the last light, and somewhere high in the dark, the vultures shifted their wings. The game was still on, and she intended to lead it exactly where she wanted. Dawn crept into the canyon like a wary animal, its pale light spilling over rock, faces the color of dried blood. The ground was still cool, holding the night's silence, until a voice cut through it, low, sharp, and edged with irritation. Jeb Crowley crouched over the body of his man, the dirt around him marked only by a single trail of hoof prints leading away. No other prints. No sign of a second shooter. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing against the sun's first glare. "No ranch hand moves like that," he muttered, his voice carrying just enough for the rest of the gang to hear. They stood in a loose circle, restless, glancing toward the canyon walls as though the stones themselves might be listening. Jeb's gaze followed the tracks up toward higher ground, his mind working through the possibilities. Whoever this woman was, she'd taken one of his, without a wasted step. That wasn't luck. That was skill. Clara was already miles ahead, her chestnut mare picking careful paths across the ridge. The high ground offered more than a view. It offered choices. She rode in the shadows of jagged stone, the sun glinting now and then off the barrel of the Colt under her coat. Below her, the canyon floor twisted in narrow runs, pockets of sage and mesquite breaking up the dust. She could see them in the distance, tiny figures on the move, but she kept her pace steady. By midday, the heat pressed down hard enough to turn breath into fire. Clara reined near a cluster of rocks, scanning the land ahead. That was when she saw them, two riders splitting from the main group, their course angled to cut her off. She let them, keeping her expression flat, her eyes half-lidded as if she hadn't noticed. They caught up fast, pushing their mounts harder, closing the distance until she could hear the jingle of tack, the rasp of spurs. One of them grinned at her, all bad teeth and worse intent, while the other's hand hovered close to his revolver. "Ma'am," the first one drawled. "Looks like you're a long way from." The rest of his words died in the crack of gunfire. Clara's draw was a blur, her Colt clearing leather and spitting lead before either man could blink. The first shot took the grinning man clean through the chest. The second snapped the other's gun from his hand and punched him out of the saddle. The echoes rolled through the canyon, bouncing off the walls like distant thunder. For a moment, everything stilled, the horses stamping nervously, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the dry air. She dismounted, stepping over the dust-choked body of the first man without looking down. The second was groaning, clutching at his shoulder. Clara knelt just long enough to push his weapon farther out of reach, her eyes flat as river stones. Then she stood, swung into the saddle, and rode on, leaving him alive but broken. Miles behind, Jeb Crowley pulled his horse to a stop when the echoes reached him. His men shifted uneasily, looking to him for orders. He didn't speak at first, just stared toward the sound's origin, jaw tight. "She's not running," he said finally, "and she's not green." A slow smile crept across his face, not one of humor, but of interest, the way a man might look at a puzzle worth solving. "We take her alive. I want to see what makes her tick." The canyon wound tighter as the day wore on, the walls pressing in like the throat of some vast beast. Clara rode through its shadows with the same unhurried grace, eyes flicking to every ridge and crevice. Once, a faint memory stirred. Men in blue uniforms, the rattle of sabers, the stink of black powder. She had been younger then, her hair tucked under a forage cap, the brass buttons on her jacket catching sunlight as she outshot every man in the line. It hadn't been for glory. In fact, the officers had kept her skill quiet, sending her to teach recruits behind closed doors. Couldn't have the newspapers printing that a slip of a woman could put lead on target faster than any decorated captain. When the war ended, her name never made the rolls, but the men she taught carried her lessons home, most without ever knowing the truth of who trained them. The present came back sharp when her mare's ears twitched. Clara slowed, scanning ahead. A rope snare lay hidden under a thin drift of sand, its loop wide enough to take a horse's leg. She swung down, cut the rope with a flick of her knife, and followed it to a stake driven deep into the ground. Farther on, she spotted another trap, this one a crude deadfall of rock, balanced on a ridge, so a nudge would send it crashing down onto the trail. She found the trigger stick, knocked it loose, and watched the boulders tumble harmlessly to the canyon floor. Dust rose in lazy swirls before settling back into silence. Jeb's men weren't subtle, but they were persistent. The traps kept coming, spike boards buried under leaves, tripwires strung low across narrow passes. Clara dismantled each one with the same calm, methodical care, never leaving a trace of her presence except for the absence of danger. By the time the sun began to dip, she'd counted at least 5 attempts to catch her. None had even slowed her down. Somewhere behind, she knew Jeb was realizing it too, that they weren't chasing prey. They were following someone who understood the land, the fight, and the rules better than they did. The canyon widened again, spilling out into a basin lit gold by the setting light. Clara paused there, letting the mare drink from a shallow pool. In the still water, she saw her own reflection, hat shadowing her eyes, dust streaked across her cheek, the faint outline of the revolver's grip pressing against her coat. The echoes of the day's gunfire still lingered in the stone around her, and she knew they'd carry to the ears of every man hunting her. Let them hear it. Let them wonder. She mounted up without hurry, turning the mare toward the next bend in the canyon, where the light was already thinning into shadow. Somewhere ahead, the night was waiting. Somewhere behind, Jeb Crowley was coming fast, a man eager to test the measure of the gun no one had seen until it was too late. The sun was already bleeding into the horizon when Clara veered off the main canyon trail, her mare's hooves crunching over a narrow track half swallowed by weeds. It wound between low ridges, opening suddenly into a flat, barren stretch of ground where crumbling stone walls rose like broken teeth against the sky. The cavalry outpost had been abandoned for over a decade, but the outlines were still there, the barracks, the storehouse, the watchtower leaning under its own weight. She had walked these grounds before, years back, wearing Union blue and a sidearm that had startled more than a few seasoned soldiers. She dismounted in the courtyard, the wind sighing through splintered beams and the gaps where doors used to hang. Every shadow was familiar. She knew where the light would fall when the moon rose, where the ground dipped just enough to trip a man who didn't know the terrain. In the west, the sky dimmed from copper to bruised purple. Hoofbeats reached her first, slow at first, then growing in number and weight. 6 horses, though she knew it was fewer now. The gang had bled men since they'd started chasing her, but their leader was still coming. She tied her mare in the lee of a wall, brushed the dust from her coat, and loosened the straps on her revolvers. The air seemed to tighten around her, heavy with expectation. They came just after full dark, their silhouettes cutting against the pale gleam of the rising moon. The first 2 slipped in from the east, rifles low. Clara was already moving, ghosting from one patch of shadow to another, her boots silent on the packed earth. When the nearest man turned his head, she stepped out, both Colts rising in the same smooth motion. 2 shots cracked through the stillness, sharp, certain. One man dropped without a sound, the other with a strangled cry that died before it left the courtyard. From the far side, another wave came, a shout, the glint of steel, the smell of sweat and powder. Clara ducked behind a fallen beam, the wood splintering under a bullet, then came up firing. Her right-hand shot dropped one. Her left-hand shot sent the other sprawling into the dust. The echoes clung to the walls, bouncing back as if the stones themselves were speaking her name. In the confusion, a lone figure broke away from the fight, a younger outlaw, fear bright in his eyes. He ran for the horses, leapt into the saddle, and rode hard into the night. Clara let him go. She wanted someone to carry the story. Then the noise faded, leaving only the steady sound of boots on stone. Jeb Crowley stepped into the open, his rifle gone, his hand hovering over the revolver at his hip. The moonlight lit the planes of his face, the narrow set of his mouth. Clara stood in the center of the courtyard, dust swirling around her ankles. "Reckon you've cost me half my men," he said, voice low, almost conversational. "And I don't even know your name." Her eyes never left his, her fingers resting just above the grips of her guns. "Clara Dane," she said simply. He tilted his head, as if tasting the sound of it. "Never heard of you." A faint smile curved her mouth, not warm, not mocking, just there. "They used to call me Lightning Hand." Recognition flickered, quick and sharp. Every man who drifted through the territories had heard the whispers of a Union scout who could draw faster than the blink of an eye, who had cut down Confederates and raiders alike before vanishing after the war. The tale had always ended the same. No one ever saw her face. "You're a ghost," he said. "Maybe," she answered. "You'll find out." The air between them seemed to shrink, the night holding its breath. His fingers twitched, and hers moved faster than the eye could follow. The Colt in her right hand bucked once, the shot tearing into the ground inches from his boot. Before he could recover, her left hand came up, the barrel stopping just shy of his temple. "You're alive because I say so," she told him. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held the weight of 100 choices made in places just like this. "Remember that when you wake up." The last thing Jeb Crowley saw before darkness took him was the faint gleam of her revolver in the moonlight. At dawn, the sheriff in the nearest town stepped out of his office to see Clara riding in, her mare steady despite the extra weight slung across the saddle. Jeb was tied there, unconscious, his hands bound tight. Clara slid from the saddle, handed the reins over without a word. The sheriff looked from her to the outlaw, then back again. "That's Crowley." Clara only tipped her hat, the early sun painting her silhouette in gold. Without waiting for thanks, she swung back into the saddle. By the time the sheriff thought to ask who she really was, she was already a mile down the road, the dust of her passing curling in the morning light. Somewhere out there, the legend of Lightning Hand Dane had just begun again. The morning sun spilled gold over the quiet main street, painting the dust in shimmering bands. Folks gathered in clusters, murmuring low, eyes drawn to the figure slumped over the saddle of a weathered bay mare. Rope bound his hands and feet. His head hung forward, blood dried at his temple. Jeb Crowley, the scourge of 2 counties, had been dragged into town like a broken scarecrow, and it wasn't the sheriff who'd brought him in. From the porch of the mercantile, The boy she'd saved days before peered out, his small fingers gripping the railing. He'd seen her in the firelight, in the smoke and the chaos. But here in daylight, she seemed different, calm, quiet, almost a stranger. Still, there was something in the way she held herself in the saddle, loose but ready, that told him she was still the same woman who had faced down 6 men and walked away. The sheriff stepped forward, his boots crunching the grit, and tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of what she'd done. "You've done this town and the county a service that'll be talked about for 100 years. You ever think about wearing a badge?" Her gaze shifted to him, pale eyes catching a shard of sunlight. A faint smile touched her lips, the kind that held more history than joy. "A badge is heavy in all the wrong ways," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the words seemed to settle over the crowd like a final verdict. The boy's heart swelled with something he couldn't name as she loosened the reins and let her mare turn. Folks parted without a word, some stepping back, others holding their breath. She didn't look at them, didn't wave, didn't pause to soak in the admiration that hung thick in the air. Her shadow stretched long across the desert floor as she rode out, the slow creak of saddle leather the only sound for a while. The horizon was a deep, endless blue, the kind that promised both danger and freedom. When she was just a silhouette against the sun, the boy finally whispered the name he'd overheard in town, a name the sheriff had spoken under his breath like a prayer. Clara Lightning Handane. And somewhere out there, with the wind at her back and the land open wide before her, she kept riding. In the West, legends don't ask for fame, they leave it behind in the dust.